peace among without peace among religions. And then, of course, it goes on, as we said the last time, no peace among religions without discourse among religions, and no discourse among religions without the religions knowing about each other, about their interpretation of reality and their orientation of action. And then the subtitle is Pope Francis and the Christians, Jews and Muslims in the Near East and at home. And the last time we had, that was our 92nd discourse here we had our first discourse, you have it there, and we go right away to the second one. We had our first wonderful discourse here, facilitated by my great student, Dustin Byrd, who is sitting right here, who is following the Muslim faith community. And we started out with Genesis number 1, that man is the image of God, created as the image of God, because we want to move on in terms of inner criticism. That means we have to pass some judgment, but we don't want to do that in an external way, but each religion can be judged in terms of its own norms. And that is a norm in the Hebrew Bible, a norm of the Jewish community. So that is what we started out with. And in order to have a standard by which we can measure and judge what is happening among nations and religions, particularly the three Abrahamic religions. We took a second higher standard, which we want to read tonight here, from Matthew 3:20, and that is the Sermon on the Mount, which is the basis law of Christianity. And we just want to read the first part, and we do this in the context of that our leaders say we have to have another 30-year war against ISIS, and all this which came through today, as we had once a 30-year war among Catholics and Protestants, which devastated all of Europe. So it is in this context that we start with the Sermon on the Mount, which we discussed the last time already when we talked about the Golden Rule and also the Lex Talionis, the law of revenge, which here is denied by Jesus, is broken by Jesus. And so we start out with this, and the next time we continue in the Sermon on the Mount. For I tell you, if your virtue goes no deeper than that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. So here we see a negation of Judaism. The Sermon on the Mount contains a negation, but at the same time, this negation of Judaism is not abstract, but it is concrete. That means Jesus also preserves Judaism. He elevates Judaism. He wants to fulfill Judaism. So here he states, you have learned how it was. That means by Moses and the prophet, you have heard how it was said to our ancestors, you must not kill. In reality, it means you must not murder, according to the Hebrew. And if anyone does kill, he must answer for it before the court. But I say this to you, anyone who is angry with his brother will answer for it before the court. If a man calls his brother fool, communist, extremist, and so on, he will answer for it before the Sanhedrin. And if a man calls him renegade, he will answer for it in hellfire. So then, if you are bringing your offering to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar. Go and be reconciled with your brother first, and then come back and present your offering. Come to terms with your opponent in good time, while you are still on the way to the court with him, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. I tell you solemnly, you will not get out till you have paid the last penny. So that is one little part of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the foundation or the principle or the starting point in our discussion. We don't want to be arbitrary. We don't want to get lost in this unbelievable chaos of details which is storming on us every day and which confuses our government even. So in our discourse, we went very much into a confusing amount of particulars, we say here. We remember, that's why we write it down, so that we know what we did the last time, each of which deserves a whole library of articles and books Sometimes we felt like aporia, that means in Greek, no way, a no way situation, a desperate situation. There is no resolution, we felt, to the Islamic problem. As we said, we must let the Muslim nations settle their own problem. That is true enough. But we must not forget that we are deeply involved, so we said, at home and abroad. Shootings in Canada, axing in New York, all there last week. We knew that as soon as we would violate the heartland theory, utter chaos would arise. So it did. We are responsible. We cannot withdraw. But what to do? We want to fix things. As Americans, we want to fix things fast. We can fix cars, but human crisis cannot be fixed easily. Thought must come before action. This is the most hardest of all things for us as a national character. All activism is dangerous and ultimately in vain, as we saw with our student movement in the 60s and the 70s. And what I just said here, I also said during that student movement when I was somehow the linkage between it and the universities here in Michigan. So let's pick out one thing. We said the last time, what makes us different from our chimpanzee friends who are, from whom we separated 1.5 million years ago and are still so unbelievably close to them. We are able to think, we are able to transcend, we are able to have universals, to think in universals. That means the little chimpanzees, our friend, he can only see particular chimpanzees, particular lions, particular trees, but he cannot know the species of a tree, the species of a lion, nor can he know his own species whatsoever. So he cannot transcend, he's hooked. Unfortunately, many people are still the same way. But when we are in a crisis like this, then we have to try at least to transcend and to be able to hold on to a universal like heartland theory, for instance, or modernity, and then hold on to this thought, and whatever information masses and people Google and whatever, and it becomes this insane asylum. We have to hold on to this one thought and think it through all these particulars. That means we have to see how the thought is to be particularized. So when we say modernity, we can particularize right away separation of church and Summa, for instance, so church and state and so on. And then we can go into detail, but we have to hold on to that universal while we go through the particulars. And if we cannot do that, then of course we cannot really act. We act and react. We really react to particulars and run like little madmen from one place to the other. Today the Secretary of Defense attacked his own government because what we are doing in Syria is absolutely idiotic. Of course he is right. And so you have this struggle inside of the government. You have the struggle between science and Ebola, the science on one side and the politicians on the other side. So, and they are thrown back and forth among particulars and just don't come to anything. So let's try that just for one moment there, this heartland theory, right? So let's hold on to this, what this has all to do with what is going on now. Now, first of all, we can ask ourselves, does anybody know anything about it? Well, probably not. So it was in the 20th century that this heartland theory was created by a professor and his son in Germany. And it meant that the one who controls Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, that he would also control the landway to India, could cut the line between England and India, the landway, that it could also control not only the eastern part, the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but also the North African coast. So it could hold it all together. At that time, it was still, the Near East was under control of France and England. But the Germans developed this heartland theory. Now, this heartland theory was put into practice. So if we have a universal which people collectively try to realize, then we should be able to reflect on this. So the Germans and Hitler, they attacked in Africa to El Alamein and Alexandria and wanted to go to Iran. Iran is an Aryan nation. Iran are not Semites. So the Arabs are Semites, the Jews are Semites, they are brothers to each other, and sometimes brothers hate each other most. So this, there they want to meet with the Shah there in Iran. And then another troops went through the Caucasus. They wanted to go through the Caucasus, and but they got stuck in Stalingrad and were beaten, and their backbone was broken. That is why the war was won over fascism in Stalingrad, in Kursk, and in Moscow, and in Berlin. And so they never got there. When Hitler never got there, he put that professor with the heartland theory into a concentration camp in Dachau in Munich. And then he was liberated by American troops, and he was taken over here to Washington. And in Washington, he established an institute, a geopolitical institute. And throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the American government followed this. Now, about 10 years ago or so, the Jesuits discovered that this was a Nazi thing, and they threw them out. But they stayed in Washington, and they continued to counsel the American government, one president after the other, including Kissinger and so on. So up to the first Bush. The first Bush made this attack, the first Iraq war, and he stopped, as you know, short of Baghdad. He stopped short of Baghdad because of the heartland theory. Because when you weaken Saddam Hussein too much, then Iran would become more and more powerful, and the whole thing would become imbalanced, and it would be a horrible chaos. Everybody said this. So, see, when we have to learn to just to transcend those confusing particulars in which also the press is involved, and they forget half of it, and so on. That is why we don't come to any adequate policy anywhere. So we have to learn that for our survival's sake. We have to learn to think. That means to hold on to universals, to see how they go through time, and how they are connected with particulars. So, but the son of the president, who did not have his brain, he then, when he was at the same place, he wanted to do it better than his father. So he marched then into Baghdad, took Baghdad, hanged Saddam Hussein in the most shameful way ever. And the Sunnis were standing around and said, we will take revenge for generations and generations and so on. And all what the government here said, who took the picture? Who took the picture of the hanging? Instead of being aware that the Americans had given the Shiites that Sunni president, who, by the way, died very much in a statesmanlike way, in a very brave way, but instead of looking at their own shameless act that they had delivered it, they wanted to catch the guy who took the picture and so on. So all this is one idiocy after the other, and the next idiocy was they threw all the bad generals out. Saddam Hussein's bad generals who led the army had never resisted us, because you cannot with a tank army resist another army with helicopters and airplanes and so on. So they withdrew right away into the desert, dug the weapons there and so on. But they were willing to come out and to work with the Americans, and we could have re-employed it. But we have not employed them because that was Saddam Hussein or whatever. The Ba'ath Party also governs in Syria. So then they, a few years ago, they began to join the resistance, and they have done all the things which the ISIS has done. That means they were hired by ISIS. And so the fast movement in the last 3 or 4 months that they are now all around Baghdad and so on, from the far north up down there, every position they took on the way, you can do that only with the tremendous leadership. And the Ba'ath Party was trained by Zhukov. Zhukov is a dialectician, a dialectical general, and he beat the people of Hitler's generals, who were all trained like ours as positivists. That's another thing which you have to connect with this heartland theory and so on. So that means you can stand with a universal, and then you connect it with these particulars, but you must never lose the universal in the whole process. So that is what why I would like our discourse to be as disciplined as possible, and then to write down a little bit of it that helps to make it in a more disciplined way. Otherwise, forget again what we said the last time, or we forget what we just said at the same time. Okay, so that is the heartland theory, and according to the theory, you could also predict what would come, but the heartland theory is connected with all kinds of other difficulties and problems. So that should not have happened, because we had faced already dialectical warfare generals, namely General Giap in Vietnam, and he had beaten us in spite of the fact that we killed 2 million Asians who are on our conscience. So in spite of all that killing, in spite of masses of bombers, thousands of bombers who bombed the north and killed all these people, and it didn't help at all. And all our tanks, they had no tanks, they had no airplanes, and they beat us anyway. Because also warfare is not only a chimpanzee business. So you cannot simply say we come from the chimpanzees, that's why we are killers, therefore Syria happens. Because there is something in between, an evolutionary process. So Syria is the killer, but it is also something else than this, and that is thought. That means we cannot avoid it, that even when we behave like chimpanzees, we still have something more than chimpanzees, and that is thought. And if you have dialectical thought, or you are positivist, as we have a complete positivistic education here, that makes a great difference in all aspects of life, but also in military science and military life as well. So after we have been beaten in Vietnam, and the communists took over, and now we trade with them very nicely. We get now our rubber very peacefully. Why we did all that killing, including our 58,000 who died there. And 58,000 hanged themselves here at home on top of it. Not to speak 300,000 who were wounded and so on. So in spite of all that, we cannot change thought here because we don't even know what it is. So to change from positivistic thought to dialectical thought is a tremendous advantage. So nevertheless, we haven't done it, and so we lost Afghanistan and we lost Iraq. Both wars were lost. Now we get to continue the lost war. This is the most idiotic of all things. In the meantime, we have in Syria a small group who wants to get rid of the Assad government. We have the ISIS who want to also to get rid of the Assad government. Now at this moment we bomb the ISIS people in Syria. Thereby we help Assad, whom we want to depose. That is what the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense attacked the White House today about. So, of course, it is unbelievably idiotic. So we want to have that freedom fighters. These freedom fighters don't even exist. And we want to take them to Saudi Arabia, where all my friends are coming from in my class, and we want to train them there, which takes a year. That means in a year we want to send them back so that they would fight against the Assad government, which in the meantime we have liberated because we bombed ISIS into the Stone Age. So idiotic you get when you cannot think. And it is something which goes through the whole system. We are working with Harvard University. It's not much better there at all. We have just read an article in the Harvard Press and so on. It's the same thing from our Ivy League places there down to the smallest college. So, okay, I just want to make that one thing, so that's why I printed it out a little bit. Heartland theory, right? A little word like this, like for instance, capitalism. If you have one word, surplus value, you can dissolve it all. But if you leave that out and you don't teach it in K College and you don't teach it here, then people don't have that universal and they cannot decode and they don't know where they are. Then they call capitalism democracy or democracy capitalism and so on. And it's just this madhouse in which we are. Not to speak the pills on which our students have to be in order to be halfway normal. So, okay, so that was just one example, and there are others we don't want to go into. And I want to stop for a moment. Is there anything you would like to add to it? But there is a little chapter there, universals, in which I explained that a little bit. So it's just a repetition. So unlike our brothers the chimpanzees, with whom we are 93%, if not more, of our genome, we share with them, including our death drive, our killer instinct, our murderous element. We had, again, every 2 weeks we have a mass murder. We had one in Washington again. And so we can predict in 2 weeks we'll have another mass murder again. And we cannot help ourselves somehow. We don't know why this is happening. And the press repeats idiotically again and again the same thing, alone or whatever, left alone, whatever. And nobody comes to the cause of the whole thing. So we can think we can transcend from the particulars to the universals, from the trees to the forest, even to the absolute universal, which is what we call God, usually. God is the all-embracing universal. Universal, that means one, and versare means to turn. It is this reality which turns everything into one and connects everything with each other. So religion is concerned with the highest and the absolute universal. And that therefore religion is not a matter of feeling or singing or whatever. Religion is first of all a matter of thought, and those who don't have any thought, like our pets, don't have religion. The dog doesn't have any religion. So it's a nice fellow, he can feel like we, he has anxieties like we, is hysterical like we, and so on, but he cannot think. Okay, so the war throughout the Levante with ISIS, the Islamic State as it is called now, with the Caliphate or with the Caliph Baghdadi, with the Islamic Brotherhood, with Hamas, with Hezbollah, there are hundreds of them. So, but all these hundreds of them have something in common, and here we have another universal. Back to that universal is modernity and its particularization. So let me just for a moment do that once more, so that one knows how this thinking process is going. So modernity, there is our friend. There's modernity itself coming to us. Join us. Can you? We have another thing for you, yes. David.
Right here.
Okay, let me just practice this once more. What is going on with modernity? This country is one of the most modern countries in the world, if not the most modern one. What does that mean now? 400 years ago, something happened in the small little European peninsula. Namely, that something which had happened before the printing press happened also in China, and powder was developed also in China, and the steam engine was also discovered in Greece, and so on. So there were elements of modernity there which didn't come off. But in Europe then, what didn't come off in China and in Greece and so on, or in any other culture, that did come off here in the West. That means after 1,000 years of scholasticism with Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventura and so on, a change took place. That means Plato had taught that the universal is above things in heaven. The universal of a tree, of the singular tree, is somewhat in heaven. Aristotle took that down, and the Arabs did this, and Thomas Aquinas did that. So the universal then was in the tree, as the purpose force which makes the tree grow in a certain way, and so on. And then came something which was called nominalism. That means the universal was not before, like in the mind of God for Augustine. It was not in the tree, like for Thomas Aquinas and for Averroes, a great Muslim scholar, but it was post. The universal was post-rem, after the thing. That means only in our head. That was an amazing thing because the whole country here is nominalistic. It's not only positivistic, it's nominalistic. And so when the Pope talks, who is an Aristotelian, and he talks to nominalists, they must misunderstand at least 1/3 of the whole thing, what he says, if not 2/3. So nominalism then was to Gabriel Biel, it got to Luther, the whole Reformation became nominalistic. The whole bourgeois revolution became nominalistic. The whole socialistic revolution became nominalistic. So except that in Marx there are Aristotelian elements still present. So nevertheless, it came out of the church. So the split between modernity or secularity and the faith community, it came out of the faith community, and you can trace this now still. The faith community suddenly consisted of people who were naive in a good sense now. I don't mean that in a bad sense, but people who were not educated, not sufficiently educated. They just said, priest says, father says, nun says, and so on, and they followed this, and they didn't want to be disturbed, and so on. And we have masses of this all over the country, and so on. There are people there who followed the monkey trial, and so on. We have a case there where the nun is, this nurse is running around there, doesn't want to obey the governor, and the governor governs a state where they still go on with the monkey trial and don't believe in evolution and so on. So we still have this whole thing going on. So nevertheless, the community divided, and one part remained naive and just read the Bible as it was written there. And in the Sermon on the Mount, according to Matthew, it was on a mountain. According to Luke, it was on flat land, and they were not disturbed by this. Jesus says, look at the birds, do it like the birds. Don't work, they don't work and eat anyway. And then St. Paul says, well, who does not work should not live, should not eat, and so should not live. and these contradictions, the naive guy sits there and listens to it. But then there were more and more people who got educated and said, you cannot give us this stuff there. One said this, the other one says this, and so on. And so more and more this educated part moved away. They stayed still a long time. Our scientists still were buried in the church up to the 19th century or so. But slowly they got out more and more and more. It had something to do with the stubbornness of people. The last Pope, Benedict XVI, broke to pieces over it because he started out to make an outright attack against modernity, which one could not make. He suddenly said the Inquisition was right anyway against Galileo, 70-year-old man to whom they showed the waterboarding and so on, as if that was an argument. So the differentiation got deeper and deeper as it had been nowhere else, not the Topian Islanders, not any tribe or whatever, and it is deepening as we are talking. It is deepening as we are talking with every culture war issue which comes up. If it is the abortion, or if it's birth control, or if it's whatever modern issue comes, sperm cell, don't have to go into detail. So, nevertheless, and it cannot be stopped. Of course, we have 30 states now which has gay marriage and so on, and the Supreme Court next year probably will make a decision that all states are supposed to have it, and so on. So it cannot be stopped, and as people didn't even notice that in the modern state then, the mythological basis underneath, that means the faith basis, was slowly removed from it, and science was pushed underneath it, and of course the people, the uneducated people, they needed images and stories in order to elevate themselves, and these stories disappeared and they were left in utter despair. And on the other hand, they did not grasp science, so they could not even get guidance from science, and so you have this mass confusion all over the place. So nevertheless, that is now modernity. So if you want to know what is happening in ISIS and the different groups of the Muslim Brotherhood, it is one huge upheaval of one great world religion against modernity. Is that something new? No, we are sitting here in a Christian place which follows the third paradigm of Christianity, Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism for 1,000 years went through this. It came out of the Roman Catholicism, the whole problem. And then the church fought for 400 years, together with the Anglicans and so on, against Galileo, against Darwin, against Marx, against Freud, and they lost every rearguard struggle on the way. So that means they first said, no, that is true, that's untrue, and so on, or said to Darwin, your grandfather was an ape, and so on, and then did not bury him, and finally they buried him in their main church in London anyway. So that means they had to give in every time. And if you do that for 400 years, that means for 12 generations, you lose all credibility which you may ever have had. If you can be so wrong about secular things, about scientific things, of biology and physics and mechanics and so on. Not all, of course. When I go to Brovnik, there was a Jesuit in the 17th century who anticipated the whole quantum physics. So we had people there, but they were all trampled down by the other chimpanzees who are running over them and so on. So we did have people, and they were not adequately treated. And up to Benedict XVI, we would have to take care of the uneducated. That's fine. He should take care of them and so on. But at the same time, the unbelievable problem, that problem of modernity developed. So the Catholic has it very easy to know what is going on in the Brotherhood. The same thing what went on here. Up to Benedict, who is still in the Vatican, we visited, you can all look at this beautiful book there. He sits there like a little monk now and plays piano and so on. So I had to struggle here with the bishop. The bishop said he's old and so on. Of course he's old, but there were hundreds of old popes who didn't resign. So he resigned because he was finished. That is why he resigned. And he came in the first place as inquisitor and as pope, because during the Vatican Council, the scholastic model finally was buried. That comes here to us very close, because in Toronto, We had a neo-scholastic school, which then came here in the medieval institute, is a residual of this whole thing. So neo-scholasticism was no longer usable, even in its beautiful neo-forms and so on. So therefore, the church could not deal with it anymore, and hoped that the Benedict Ratzinger would bring a patristic model, and we could think through our problems in terms of the Greek church fathers, Origenus, who founded the Orthodox paradigm, and Augustine, who founded the Roman Catholic paradigm. So then we could think things through, but he couldn't. That means he could as little use the forms of patristic of the fathers as they could use Thomas Aquinas in order to settle the problem with modernity. Here it is again, the universal, to which you always have to come back so that you have it connected there. Otherwise, if you lose it, then you will not come to any practical thing in the end. So we can only come to the right praxis through the right analysis. And this analysis needs the universal. So when we want to know what they're all about, we thought already in the West that religion was finished. Nietzsche had said it, Marx had said it, Freud had said it, and so on. And then suddenly comes this unbelievable upheaval and forces the West even to call itself post-secular. But post-secular doesn't mean that secularity has ended or whatever, or that religion comes back again. It means that it goes slower than they thought. That means what Islam has done, it has slowed down somehow the process of modernization. It has forced modern people to reflect on their modernity and their secularity and so on a second time and see if they maybe had not too abstractly negated religion, and if there was not something in religion like created according to the image of God or so, which one should have preserved in order to prevent barbarism, the fascist barbarism who happened in Germany, my homeland. So, and which can happen in any country which comes into similar situations. So, if the rabbi just made that clear to it, I took my class to the rabbi and said, there was the most cultivated country in the world there, and there it happens. You know, what that can show us is that countries which are less cultivated may even get it more than the Germans did. So, nevertheless, so then it helps us when we reflect our own, if we are rooted, for instance, in the Catholic tradition or the Protestant tradition, the fourth paradigm, then Protestantism was the first way of Christianity to deal with modernity. And it was a very heroic type of a thing. So we have Martin Luther King, who had all the material, Martin Luther had all the potentials of a saint in him, this feeling of sinfulness, the feeling to be justified in faith and so on. And what a struggle this man went through in this Augustinian Eremite monastery in Wittenberg and so on. So, he wanted to have a reform of the church. He never thought of splitting the whole church up in 1,200 different groups here, and in Europe 3 groups or so. So that was not the plan. When he came home after he translated the Bible, he came to Wittenberg and saw all the churches devastated. He said, "My God, what has happened?" That was not the intent in the whole thing. And anyway, the religious, the theological problem of justification was resolved already in the Trent Council, so in the 40s and 50s of the 16th century. So, but it became a political affair and so on. So, by the way, secularization is an economic concept. So it meant the secularization of the church property by Napoleon. And from secularization then of the church, that means the church property was stolen by the princes, and the princes promised to pay the priests, by the way, applying that to us here. No prince stole any church property here, and there's the question why the church doesn't pay its own salary better of its priests and ministers and so on. But that is a private affair here. So, but nevertheless, in Europe, in Germany, even the Nazis and the communists paid the priests still, because the state promised when they stole the property that they would pay forever the ministry. Okay, so nevertheless, here we have this again. So then we can approach them and can say, now, what is it now? What is it in modernity? And we understand also their maneuver. and the cohesion in their maneuver. We see that, for instance, our friend there, Bin Laden, that he was paid by us in order to help the people in the east there to attack the Russian troops which had come in, because socialism was the second modernization. The first modernization is the bourgeois one. Our constitution here is the French constitution. So that means our state organization comes all from the French Enlightenment and from the British Enlightenment. So the society consists of innumerable little groups who have monkey trials and so on. But the state is a process of enlightenment, a product of enlightenment, which produces all kinds of difficulties of average people not getting a real connection to the government, who trust their capitalists more than they trust the government, in spite of the fact that the state is the only guarantee of their freedom under their capitalistic masters and so on. And no Labour Party. There's no country without a Labour Party and so on. So all that hangs together. So nevertheless, when we see what we have now, we know that whole thing is a struggle against modernization. Bin Laden's struggle was first against the socialistic modernization. Then when that was settled and they thought they had beaten that, then they turned against the older form where this other form came from, because the socialistic modernization happened when the bourgeoisie made its constitution only for the third estate and left out the fourth estate, not to speak of the slaves who Jefferson had in front of the house there, or his black wife and the children whom they even never liberated and so on. So that means it was to be universal, the Constitution, freedom for all, equality of all, and so on. And then they noticed more and more that it was only for the third estate, and that the fourth estate was left out. So the fourth estate rebelled then in 1700, in 1831, in 1800 in Paris, in 1870 in Paris again, then in Hamburg and in Munich, and in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and then in Peking, and so on. And this is continuing, of course. In Peking, they have to pay us in order to get out of our crisis, which is a very strange type of situation. So, but when we want to think it through, we have to go back always again to modernization. So what is this modernization doing to them? How do they think, why do they think that modernization wants to get at Islam so that they can call jihad? Because jihad means to fight with your inner chimpanzee, but it also means then to fight when Islam is attacked. It's a fight of life and death. Why do they think that modernity hits at Islam? Well, we Catholics should know this. Why did Ratzinger make an outright fight after all the popes of the 19th century against this whole thing? And that when his predecessor had already said maybe the Inquisition was wrong, why did he reinforce it again? No, the Inquisition was right and Galileo was wrong, and so on. See, little things like this. Modernization, that's where it is. So, well, they don't want to have the fate for Islam which Catholicism has suffered in the West. Because what this modernization means, for instance, one little part of it is separation of church and state, or separation of Ummah and state. And that means right away, automatically privatization. And privatization means religion has to get out of my bedroom. Religion has to get out of the economy. Religion has to get out of the state. Religion has to get out of international relationships. When we want to use them, like they used John Paul II, whom they paid, and he paid the money to the solidarity unions in order to throw the communist government, then, of course, then they can use the church to instrumentalize. Like Jefferson said already, let them read the Bible, then we can govern them better. This humanization, this annihilation of religion, which has happened, it was already from the very beginning a superficial type of a conversion of the Germanic tribesmen and so on. But now instead of superficial, it becomes phony all over the place. So that is what they don't want to happen to Islam, what has happened to Christianity over here. That means they think that Islam is holistic, so does Christianity. That means it penetrates the family, civil society, the state, history. Everything is under the Decalogue. Everything is under the Sermon on the Mount. And that we cannot do the Sermon on the Mount. Or the Sermon on the Mount is just there to remind us how sinful we are. Or the Sermon on the Mount is just illusory. Or it can be, I just heard it on television again all the time, a Sermon on the Mount is just for private life. As if Jesus had not gone before Pilate and discussed the same thing and so on, who was the representative of the Roman state and so on. So that means this shrinkage, this miserable cutting to pieces of Christianity by its own people, by its own clergy and so on. Every day, every mass which you see here, you can see how, or any sermon which the rabbi gives down there, or the imam, you see how they have to shield the critical elements of their religion so that it doesn't come out, because they want to be in peace with those who pay them. And it just leads to a disaster. So when we see this, then we know what our Islamic brothers and sisters are fighting for. It is not difficult. You don't have to create quantum physics or whatever. It is very simple. Just remember what we have suffered here under a capitalistic system, under the feudal system before, and then, or the slave system, and then see what they are fighting for. And then it's perfectly clear. Then when you have this, then you can say, well, can be done something about modernization, or can be done something about religion in order to reconcile this horrible antagonism. So after you have unfolded the phenomenon of modernization, then you can also ask the question, what can we do? Is there anything in modernization which could be changed in such a way that these people there in the Near East and all along North Africa and in Indonesia, where the majority of them live, that they wouldn't feel threatened anymore? We cannot simply say the modernity does not threaten anybody. Modernity has threatened Christianity for 400 years and has driven it in the corner, or has adopted it. So therefore, that we cannot say. So it is a danger. But what can be done in order to modify modernity as we move into a postmodern situation? Postmodernity will not mean pre-modern. Any religious person who has the hope that we will get into a pre-modern Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox type of a thing, it is hopeless. They will go forward with all the trends which are intrinsic to this tremendous potential of modernity. And look what we do with our computers there and our telephones. Everybody runs around like little chimpanzees and imitates these telephones and so on. They have it under control, absolutely under control. So, and this will continue then where? Alternative future number 1, a totally administered society. Alternative future number 2, a 30-year war, or maybe ABC wars. Or number 3, is it possible to steer the whole thing toward a reconciled society in which the antagonism between the sacred and the profane, between the individual and the collective, between the classes and so on, can be reconciled more than it is, or can be reconciled all. And now the question is then, are we, as modern people, are we prepared to discuss those things? Town hall meetings or whatever, are we at this point where we can discuss it at all? And then there is the question, of course, which we have to ask, the Ratzingers and so on. Look at the struggle, Ratzinger on one side, Hans Küng on the other side, and Johannes Baptist Metz on the other side. So there you have Ratzinger there, who had this experience in Tübingen, where the students said, down with Christ and so on, and he was so shocked that he wanted to go to Innsbruck and hide in the monastery there, which he finally has done now. So horrible it was. Ratzinger is not a bad man. He was in the Hitler Youth. He said he never went. He had to go, so he must not remember it anymore. He also deserted from the German army, which I could never do because I didn't know when the German army was illegitimate, and he had taken an oath anyway, which he shouldn't break after he has done it. We both shouldn't have taken an oath anyway, because the Sermon on the Mount forbids it as satanic. So, but we did take the oath, and if you take one, then at least what you have to do is to hold on to it until you know that your government is illegitimate. And the German government was recognized to the very end, beyond the death of Hitler, So therefore it was never delegitimated, and therefore a soldier did not really have the permission to desert. But nevertheless, that is, he uses those stories then and used them and so on for, and this experience, a trauma which the student movement put into his soul. And this trauma, it is also not true that he was ever a critical theologian during the Vatican Council. He negated all innovations in the council except the liturgical ones. So therefore, the fairy tale is a myth that he had a conversion. It was not a conversion. He just became more conservative than he had been in the first place. So, and therefore he was even put into this there. John Paul II was a Slavic pope, and he therefore was intellectual, not high up enough, and therefore they put Ratzinger right behind the throne. And after he was dead, then they put Ratzinger in with his new paradigm. And the other one, Francis, was supposed to go in already when Ratzinger went in there, but the Curiers changed it again and put Ratzinger in order to get the orthodoxy straight. And he is the one who repressed the liberation theologians in the basic Christian community and worked together with the CIA in Nicaragua and so on and so on. And this present Pope there did not protect his priests in Brazil when we had a fascist government there controlling our resources and so on. And two priests, one of them reconciled himself with him in Germany. Recently, they celebrated the Mass together and then they reconciled, and the other one died without reconciliation. So he was not a Romero, the present Pope, right? Romero died because he stood up. And the 6 Jesuit priests in El Salvador, in the university there, who were all economists and showed people what capitalism is and how many pounds of coffee you need in order to feed a family, and that you cannot feed the family. And they were killed because they suggested that they should organize. We are now in a hostile state against unions and so on. So if with the right-to-work law here, that means a working class state, Michigan suddenly has a right-to-work law, and you can see exactly where we are and in which direction we are going. So that means you can see Providence at work in the newspaper, on the television station. So nevertheless, this for us is important. When we are in this confusion, and as I showed you now, this heartland theory thing, universal, and then that modernity thing, universal, that you can then accumulate, then you can, in God's name, Google if you want to, and then it makes sense, but you cannot Google thinking. That's no thinking on Google whatsoever. So I let all my students Google as much as they want during the exam, and they still get a C or D or whatever, because there's no thinking in Google. So, but what you can get in Google, you can get the facts. And if you can do the thinking, you can hold on to these universals and think it through, then Google can be very helpful. As a matter of fact, we are the best informed people ever. You can take the station 197, for instance, on your television, international station, and you get the news from France and England and Switzerland and everywhere. Nobody ever had a chance like this. So we don't have an excuse that we are not informed enough. We do know what our government does. We know that we have invaded 25 countries since 1945. We know that we have had regime change, the same number of regime changes, and we want to do another regime change in Syria and don't know how the hell to do it. That is the embarrassment at this moment and so on. So the American people the Germans could say, well, we don't really know what Hitler did with the non-aggression pact against with the Soviet Union or whatever, but we have no excuse, because you just have to turn that thing on, and sometimes against their own will they reveal it to you. If you take Fox and you compare Fox with CNN and so on, you do get to the truth, because they contradict each other, and out of the contradiction comes the truth. So you can get it, but you must make some effort, you know. So the American people has no excuse whatsoever when they say we don't know what we have been doing and so on. So, but this is not, we are not a political thing, but something from a religious community point of view. We have suffered so much from the modernization process. We have made so many mistakes in order to make that modernization process so ugly sometimes as it has become for religious people and so on. So, but from our experience and from our thought, we can go to the mosque here on this campus. I get the Sunnis together now, I don't get the Shiites and so on. They have their own problems. So nevertheless, and we can talk with them. We can honestly feel, we do feel their problem. And we don't say, you know, the problem is this ISIS or this or this. The problem is the whole thing. That means that the world religion, after Christianity had been pushed into the corner, suddenly rises again and say, no, this will not happen to us under no circumstances. We will not be cut out of the family, cut out of the economy, cut out of the state, cut out of history, cut out of culture, and so on, out of the question, and so on. That is the resistance. So what are we doing with this resistance? That means we are brothers to the Muslims, we are brothers to the Jews, and together with them we have to find ways to speak to modern people, and modern people also have the responsibility to talk to religion as well. If we have people, scientists, and say, we go ahead with the stem cell program and so on, okay, we need the embryo for 2 weeks, and then we take the element out, and then we kill the little thing, and so on. And that is good for Alzheimer's and so on. Then we have to see, first of all, that religious people and secular people want to heal Alzheimer's. So they do have something in common after all. What do all our nuns here, St. Joseph nuns and so on, what did they do with their whole lives? They were in the hospital, they wanted to heal people. So therefore religious people want to heal and secular people want to heal. So they have something in common. But they have even more in common. The embryo for the biologist is not just a chimpanzee embryo. It is a specifically human embryo. Difference of 3-4% or whatever, it's small enough. But it is a difference. So they agree it is human. It's human. So there's another element left there. It is not a person. And therefore it's not carrier of rights or civil rights. So for Reagan, the embryo was even an American citizen. So, but it cannot be a citizen without being a person. A little dog cannot be an American citizen. So therefore, there is the point now. And there comes a point where one says, now we have to agree to disagree, but under no circumstance will we stop the discourse. So the last time we had that feeling of aporia, you know, we come to a dead-end street. When you come to this no way, there is another way. So then whatever it is, if we say we cannot follow the Sermon on the Mount, we are killers and so on, well, then let's study psychoanalysis and say where this is coming from, right? Why we cannot be in control of our id. These little guys there, the little American, Native American in the state of Washington, he fell in love with the girlfriend, his cousin stole the girlfriend, and then he shot her. Shot her dead, and the cousin's dead, they were all relatives. So he shot 5 people, and then he shot himself. And so that happens every 2 weeks. It doesn't happen in Denmark. It doesn't happen in Sweden. And so we have to see why that is happening to us. So what is it? What are we doing in the formation process? Because we don't become human like the chimpanzees become automatically chimpanzees. We do not become human automatically. We need a formation process. This formation process has to be done in the family, and the family has to have authority. If our patriarchy has broken down, then do we have a matriarchy? If not, then what the hell do we want to have? But somebody has to negate the little chimpanzee, but not in a way now with some abstractly, but negated in such a way that the little chimpanzee is also preserved and is elevated and is sublimated, because that's where all our energy comes from. If you repress it and become a neurotic, you don't have enough energy to write books or whatever. So that's not a good thing. So that means something dialectical has to be done to the little chimpanzee. If you don't negate it, you have just chimpanzees running around. If you negate it abstractly, you have a dead monk sitting there. So that would not be the right thing. And by the way, the rules of the monks are very wisely arranged in all of this. So they always drink a little bit wine and so on, which is very good for the chimpanzee. So nevertheless, this, so then we have to ask this question, what has gone wrong with modernity? What has gone wrong with our civilization? To a large extent, it's a failed civilization. A civilization which in 1918 has killed 10 million people, and which 20 years later kills another 70 million people, and then goes on with the Cold War when millions and millions are killed too. This is a failed civilization. As the state of Michigan is a culturally failed state. And I proved that to the federal government, and twice the federal government okayed it and gave me a tax deduction. So that is, these things have to be looked through. So nevertheless, back to our theme now here. we know now what our Islamic brothers, and also the Jewish brothers, and also the Buddhist brothers, by the way, what they all suffer from. And so that we then, under all circumstances, keep the discourse open. And that we do not say simply, you damn it, medical doctors, you naturalists, you positivists, you take the last little of morality out of our children, which is still into them, because that's not helpful to shout at them like this. And they can also not say, well, God sits with the bishops, God sits in 10 million wombs every year and puts a little soul into every embryo on the day of conception and so on. So then they make fun of each other and it doesn't lead anywhere. It's much too serious for this to make fun of it. So the fundamental resolution that between religious people and modern people, that the discourse is kept open between them, that is decisive. So, and both of them are dynamic, both are historical. That means both change. So suddenly a scientist can come and can say, look, we can take that cell out of your arm or whatever. Unfortunately, that cell out of your arm is too specified already and may not be really helpful. So then it goes back again. We need it from the embryo, and then we have fertilized an egg, and then we let it live for 2 weeks, and then we take that out, and then we have to kill it, and so on and so on. Then we are back to the problem. So that means the problems will not be very easy, because every day science makes another step forward. So on one day they come and say, you know, the evolution took place not in one family, but in many families in Africa. So right away you have a dogmatic problem among Christians. What about the original sin? Was that just one family? Are there some people running around without the original sin now, and others do have it or whatever? And that suddenly comes up in the 20s, and then the 30s. Every 5 minutes something comes. And when John Talha de Chardin or whatever wants to solve them, then of course they send him to China or whatever and don't listen to him. So in general, you know, somehow like a curse, we undo everybody who could help us. Marx could help us in the crisis. The Germans went to a library and studied the Marxist crisis theory when the disaster happened with finance capital and so on. So with Freud is the same thing. Freud talks too much about sex, we don't like Freud and so on. And all the television stations talked about sex all the time. So the same thing, Marx talks about economics too much, and we are not talking about anything instead of economics, the bottom line, and so on. So why are we doing away with all these beautiful people who could help us in the situation? And we need the best thinkers we can possibly get. And there are only a few every century, so we cannot waste them easily. Okay, so that was just the point here of these universals there, and then we have the other thing of modernity, so that we have it written down, and that helps us a little bit to maybe to think it through. So the point is simply we can, maybe that sounds a little bit theoretical, but we cannot simply go into this activism, let's do something, and then after a few weeks we see we haven't done anything, because without thought, nothing can be done. So we have to keep back this activism in ourselves and say, wait a minute, Marx may have been too hasty, the time has come, you know, all the people interpreted history, time has come to make history, well, it's not so easy, and now we see that making history didn't work out very well, so maybe the time has come that we interpret it again in order to find a new way to make it again. It's not easy to make this stupid thing all the time, he made a difference, it didn't make any difference whatsoever. As a matter of fact, it's very difficult to make any difference whatsoever in a thing which has been so frozen like this system. So, therefore, thinking is the only thing. And of course, faith is also thinking, right? So, somehow with thinking, people think that religion is not thinking or whatever, but it is just another form of thinking. And therefore, they are not so far away. Many problems which religious people have gone through have been taken up by the Enlighteners. Suddenly with Freud, the original sin comes up again after they had denied it in the bourgeois Enlightenment. So we are not that different, you know. There is no animal religion. Some people think that a chimpanzee, when he sees a real lion, then he runs away. When he sees a dead lion, he just stands there and doesn't know what to do. And if he sees a stuffed out lion, he has a feeling of awe, and that is religion. I mean, that's an idiotic type of religion. So, but they come up with things. They're shameless enough to come up with these idiotic ideas and so on, which all shows that they don't know anymore what thinking means. Okay, in the university, of course, and also the church. And the church was, for 1,000 years in the West, was a power of thinking. And it should continue to be that. Okay, so then we come to contemporary issues, but before we do this, are there any questions or comments, or that we can continue our beautiful discourse which we had the last time? Otherwise, we can ask Dustin to take over and tell us a little bit about that movie there and the books you bought.
Oh, well, I can say a few things about that, the books I bought. Otherwise, he's doing most of the talking tonight. I did most of the talking last time.
You're right, yeah.
Yeah, you did do most of the talking, right. But this is just the Quran, which is sacred text of Muslims. It's very interesting that.
Show us.
Well, I mean, it's this, but it's the Quran, but it's not the Quran, right? Because for Muslims, if it's not in the original Arabic language, it doesn't constitute the Quran, which is a bit of a problem for Muslims because, especially Muslims who don't speak Arabic as a first language, it's a very difficult book to break into anyways, you know, and then on top of it, you have to learn this very old, 1,400-year-old version of the language, and so very tough thing. So I have students all the time that say, well, I want to read the Quran, and the first thing I say is, good luck. It's not an easy book. On the other hand, though, it's a book of reflection that people are supposed to, you open it up, you look for something, you reflect on its meaning. You almost have like a quadriga, the quadriga, which is the different ways of interpreting, the literal interpretation, the symbolic interpretation, the poetic interpretation in many ways. And so it's arranged in a way that most people would not be familiar with. The chapters are not put in chronologically. They're put in from the longest to the shortest. So the shortest little thing there in the back is one of the earliest chapters that, according to the Islamic tradition, as a revelation that Prophet Muhammad received. That's in the back of the book, not in the front, right? And so where we think it would be. So it's obviously, from the perspective of the Muslims, it is in many ways, almost the same as Jesus himself. If Jesus is God incarnate, Muslims see the Quran as Kalam Allah, or God's words, right? And very specifically, not inspired, not written through someone else, but the Word of God, the literal Word of God. So in that kind of way, it almost is God incarnate in that sense. And so when people say, well, they want to do a Quran burning or something like that, and everyone looks and freaks out, and they said, well, if they burned the Bible, it's not that big of a deal. It's our sacred book. We'd be offended, but we're not going to get very upset. But the difference is, think about it this way. If it was Jesus himself here being burnt at the stake, Christians would have a very different, interpretation of what that would mean. They'd respond very differently to that than simply burning the Bible. So when you burn the Quran, that's how Muslims experience that, as the same way as if we were burning Jesus himself, right?
Is it similar to like how Catholics think of the Eucharist? The idea that the
Yeah,
host is Christ.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. I mean, with the transubstantiation, it's there. I mean, this is the blood of Christ. So if you think about somehow, Hegel made that little interesting comment with the mouse or whatnot, you know what I mean? But yeah, if someone were to desecrate it, desecrate the blessed wine, to desecrate the wafer or whatnot, it would be, in many ways, almost as if you were desecrating Jesus himself, right? So, but that's one thing. And what's really interesting is when I read this, and then I read the Evangelii Gaudium, the Pope's exhortation, the first one there, I'm amazed at how similar they are.
Before you go there, let's say something about the Quran. So there is a double word of God. There is a Quran in God himself. And that is the externalization of it, right?
Absolutely.
And then people say sometimes, the three religions of the book, and Muhammad said one should deal differently with the people of the book. But Christians would negate this. They would say, no, we are not a religion of the book. We are the religion of a person. So a person is in the middle. So the core of Christianity is Jesus the Christ, the Son of Yahweh and the Messiah of Yahweh, and so on. So So sometimes the Jews said, we say to the Jews, you are older than we are, and the Jews would say, no, we are younger than you are, because we are your younger brothers, because the Jews canonized their writings later than the Christians did, and therefore they think they are younger. So that between these three, and we want to concentrate on these three, and then it is then divided up in surahs, right?
Right.
And then there are also commentaries to it, right?
Right, the tafsir. And it's very difficult, I mean, to understand it.
So sometimes the Jews said, we say to the Jews, you are older than we are, and the Jews would say, no, we are younger than you are, because we are your younger brothers, because the Jews canonized their writings later than the Christians did, and therefore they think they are younger. So that between these three, and we want to concentrate on these three, and then it is then divided up in surahs, right?
Right.
And then there are also commentaries to it, right?
Right, the tafsir. And it's very difficult, I mean, to understand it, in the sense that, you know what red letter Bibles are. So if you open up a Bible, I mean, I grew up in a Calvinistic tradition, and do they do it in Catholicism too with the red letter Bibles? These are all the words of Jesus are in red letters, as opposed to
Yeah,
black,
you can
right?
have that, yeah.
Yeah, and so, so if you were to take all the red letters, all the words of Jesus out of the Bible and put them in a book in and of itself, by itself, that's what like the Quran is. So the storyline, the context, who Jesus is talking to, what's going on at the time, you know what I mean? All that stuff, it's gone. All you have is the words of Jesus, right? So for a Muslim, when they look at, say, the New Testament, they would say what Jesus spoke is the gospel. All the rest of that stuff is whoever wrote it, right? It's their words, but only what Jesus says is the gospel, right? And so that's the same here. So when you open it up and you get the speech of God, but what's the context? You know, he's telling Prophet Muhammad something, you know what I mean? And of course, he's saying something to the Prophet because something is happening at that time period, you know? And so, for instance, a good example of that, I hear it all the time, both from very, very conservative Muslims and also from Islamophobes. And there's a verse in the Quran that says, do not take Jews and Christians as your friends, right? Number one, it's mistranslated because the word for friends, there's two good words for friends, and neither of which are used in the Quran. Two good words in Arabic. But the word that it uses, dawla. And dawla is a state. And the first idea or the first role of the state is the protector of its people, right? And so it's to take Jews and Christians not as your protectors, right? And so people say, well, look, you know, obviously God is telling the Muslims don't be friends with these non-Muslims, you know, you're going to have animosity between them. Well, what's the context? The context is when, you know, Muslims were in a very threatened position. They made alliances with a particular Jewish tribe, you know what I mean, to help protect them. And then, of course, when this particular Jewish tribe saw that the other side, the pagans, were going to win this battle, they jumped ship and went with the Muslims, or went with the pagans, and almost got all the Muslims killed. And so what that verse is trying to say is, look, it is your responsibility to defend yourself. You don't expect other people to defend you. You have to defend yourself, right? That's a very different meaning than simply reading it as, don't take Jews and Christians as your friends, which is what a lot of people unfortunately interpret it. So the hermeneutics behind it is very, very difficult, and anytime someone who is, I can't even say non-Muslim, anytime someone who's very uneducated in the Islamic tradition and in Quranic exegesis, you know, I've heard it from Muslims and non-Muslims. Every time I hear someone say, I have to go back and check. When the Quran says this, you have to go back and check, right? Just because it is so easy to take out of context, because the context is not there.
And there is no magisterium, of course, right? There is no pope, there's no church which would give a binding interpretation, and we have that with Protestantism, of course, too.
Right.
You the thought that everybody would have the Holy Spirit and they all would read it the same way, and then they found out, you know, the Buddha and then whatever, Flacius Illyricus and all these people suddenly read it very differently and so on. Then it is also shorter than the New Testament, right?
Right, just a little bit shorter than the New Testament.
Right, and of course shorter than the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but then it is the sealing of all the other revelations, right? That is some non-negotiable element in Islam. And sealing means that the other two were revelations, so they are recognized by the thing. On the other hand, you know, this book was rejected by Christians because Muhammad was not monogamic. I mean, there you see that those centuries, 1600 centuries, an idiotic type of a Christian prejudice goes on. In every prophet there, Jacob was married several times, and Isaac, they all were married, heaven knows how many times, and had little concubines and had little slave girls on top of it, and so on. And then the Quran is supposed to not to be the book of Revelation, because Muhammad had one wife, 4 wives, maybe a few more, and then one in the end. So, you know, that shows the insanity inside of religion, which one has to be aware as well. But then we have to look at this when Muhammad says that this is the sealing, or the sealing of the other two.
Al-Furqan, the criteria.
Criteria. Then that means he behaves quite freely in leaving out things. By the way, when we talk that way, that's secular talk, right? That's critical theory talk. That's not the religious person's talk. The religious person talks very differently about all the holy texts. But let's talk about this in the secular way. For instance, when the Torah is a revelation, then one should think that Muhammad was not able to change anything, because that would be somehow blasphemy. But he did change. So in the Lord's story, the incest of Lot with his 2 daughters was so abominable for Muhammad that he could not endure it and threw it out and said it was a Jewish interpolation, so some devil put it into it. So in Christianity, he rejected the crucifixion, partially because he followed some Christian sources of his time, but also because he had a tremendous sensitivity for the theodicy problem. That means a just man like Jesus, prophet, messenger, could not possibly, God would not allow possibly that he would suffer such martyrdom and such torture and so on. And so therefore he just denied it, in spite of the fact that it's in all 4 Gospels and it's outside of the Gospels as well. And it's one of the most safest parts of the New Testament, including, my God, why have you forsaken me, Psalm 22, which is an unbelievable expression of despair and so on. So, but we have to know, why Muhammad rejected that, and it was also an injection. But then he believed in the Messiah, Jesus Messiah, coming. So that is what we have in common with our, Shiite brothers in Iran, who are very eschatological sometimes and think that the Jesus Messiah will appear sometimes.
The Mahdi prepares the way for the Messiah,
right,
Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, okay, so that's just a few comments to that. And what are these called, these commentaries to?
Tafsir.
Okay.
Tafsir in...
another word for it?
Well, there's the Hadith, too.
The Hadith, yeah.
And the Hadith are collections of things that the Prophet Muhammad said and did. And they have to have what's called an isnad, or a chain of transmission. And that is, in order for them to be accepted as being sound hadith, authentic hadith, they have to have a chain that says, according to Anas, who heard it from Umar, who heard it from the Prophet, right? If they have a weak chain, they'll say this is a weak chain hadith, which means it's possible he said it, but he might not have. But we know more about Muhammad than any other religious figure who was an initiator or even a founder of a religion, for the simple fact that there were so many people around him saying these things, remembering these things, and they recorded them soon after he died. So we know a lot about him. And the thing with the wives, that's a constant critique of Muhammad. When they said, well, he had maybe up to even 12 wives because he was some kind of sexual pervert or whatever. But when he was a young man, from the age of 25, his wife, who proposed to him, she was 40, he was 25, she proposed to him. They had 6 children together. They had 4 boys and 2 girls, 4 girls and 2 boys. The 2 boys both died in infancy, but the 4 girls survived. Thus, who the stronger gender is at young, And so when he's a young man and has 1 wife, he has 6 children. When later on in his life, when he has up to 12 wives, he has no children. It simply doesn't happen that way. And what those wives were cementing alliances with different tribes, whatnot, as Islam was growing. And some of them were women who had been widowed because of his companions were fighting, in a war or something, as they were attacked. and the husband was killed, and so he would marry the woman to take care of her, bring her into the house and take care of her. And so this idea that somehow he had some kind of strange sexual drives or whatnot, and that's the reason why he took all these wives, is simply not the case. Even one of the wives was Christian too, by the way, so that's not very, and I think her name was Mary, actually. She was
like
a
the
Copt.
Torah too, they all had a very healthy sex life, right?
Yeah, right, I'm sure.
But let's add another thing about modernity and that discourse. One thing which will come up in the discourse is higher criticism. That means the Holy Quran has not yet been exposed to higher criticism. The Torah has, and the New Testament has. And there is not one word in the New Testament or the Torah which has not been turned over 2,000 times by an army of scholars and so on, in terms of its validity, its authenticity, and so on and so on, what Jesus really said and what he didn't say, and so on and so on. And in some way, it has to come. There are, of course, commentaries there, but they are commentaries by believers, and so when the criteria of the modern science of history will be applied to it, that may be a shock, as it has been a shock in the West. So
it has begun too.
Yeah, right, it has begun. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So
by especially German scholars.
Yeah, right. The Protestants, did that first here in the West, and the Catholics were lagging behind. But then, in the recent decades, the Catholics have caught up with it. There was a priest Brown in Baltimore in the seminary there who did excellent work when I was teaching there. So therefore today they're on the same level or better than the Protestant. But it doesn't matter who does it, but somebody has to do it, right? So from both sides, from the secular side and so on, because they, of course, the world is not turning around the sun, and so all kinds of geographical, historical, or whatever things which come up. But it is like when you read, when you listen to music like Beethoven, and you listen to music naively, and you don't know what Beethoven really did. You just, when the drums are coming and you're jumping up and down and you're happy. But then when you study musicology, all that may get lost, right? So therefore people say when you apply higher criticism to religion, you lose it. Not necessarily. You don't lose, music because you know now that Beethoven made a mistake. He went too fast there, and the drums are too much, and so on. You should have waited a little bit, or whatever. You can look at all these things, and then you enjoy Beethoven later on, not in a naive way, and with a second naivete, with a second joy. And the same thing can happen in religion too. You have to think that our brothers, the fundamentalists, right? We have them in Judaism, we have them in Christianity, and so on. They're not bad people, and one should not make fun of them or whatever. They are people who have been hit by the Enlightenment. Fundamentalism is modern, There was no fundamentalism in the Middle Ages or Antiquity. But they are hit by the Enlightenment. They see everything swimming away. What should I tell my daughter and my grandchildren about premarital sex, after sex, whatever, divorce and all this? And so then they get frightened. And being frightened, they go back to the religion of the fathers. And then they go through it literally, which the fathers never did, by the way, in the first place. They lose contact with the historical process. They don't want to use blood or whatever, and they have to go to the courts, and sometimes children die, and so on. So it is a very, it's a very tragic thing in a certain way, fundamentalism. So no fun should be made about it. When I said these things about the monkey trial and so on, that was not a fair thing. So one has to see what is behind that, and what existential trouble people are in when they become fundamentalists. So what do we recommend? We recommend to go through this enlightenment. It will not bite, and fight oneself through and come out with an enlightened way to see things. And it may be that a society will be modern and secular, but that in this secular society there will be people who will still be religiously motivated. It will not be open, maybe, so it could be halfway open and so on, but it can be very genuine and very powerful. There will be people who will be humanistically motivated, and there will be others who will be religiously motivated. Not everything what belongs to religion can survive this. A lot of things, the Holy Inquisition can go to hell, that would be a good thing, and many other things, so which we have to repent, which we can only repent and let them sink into forgetfulness. But there are some good things in there, and they must not be lost under any circumstances. And that is what the future may very well look like. So that about what we go on. Should we go to the movie there? Or?
Yeah, we can. It's about 20 after.
Yeah. Or what do you
want to
watch?
talk about 10 more minutes, and then or
Okay,
take questions
yeah.
for about 10 more minutes, and then we can put in the film about
Did you want to
St.
say
Francis.
something about your other?
Well, yeah, actually, I was going to say with the new one, the Apostolic Exhortation that Pope Francis put out last year. I just finished in writing a book on Ayn Rand, which is got to be one of the lowest points of my life to have to read so much of Ayn Rand, but I went into a deep depression, I think. Nevertheless, the book is done, and you'd be happy to say that I used the Pope to fight against Ayn Rand. If you don't know who Ayn Rand is, she's a secular philosopher that believes that greed is good, you know what I mean, that enlightened self-interest, you know, the self-interest of the individual comes above everything, you know, altruism is evil, you should never do things for other people, you know what I mean, because it's just absolutely evil. And so she's for this most radical form of capitalism you could possibly come up with. And so when, I mean, coming from the perspective of prophetic Abrahamic religious traditions, you read what she says, and it's just the pure opposite of the social justice gospel or whatnot, or the moral values of the Quran. And then when the Apostolic Exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, came out, the Pope takes that type of thinking on directly. I mean, he just goes right after it, you know. And so I was very happy to see that what you can find with these commonalities, even among within modernity, you can find the commonalities of religious people who are embracing that prophetic, Socratic air in attitude towards the modern world, and they're not simply condemning it fundamentalistically, but they're taking that prophetic attitude towards it, including the Pope, and he shares that with the Quran, with our prophetic Jewish brothers and sisters too.
Who was that congressman that was espousing her?
Paul Ryan.
Paul Ryan, yeah, he was a almost candidate. He was
That's
vice
right.
presidential.
He was that?
He was almost a vice
President, that's right. And
Yeah,
he's-
Romney's vice
Yeah,
president.
he's my chapter number 2 in that book.
He's from
So,
Wisconsin, I think.
He's from Wisconsin, and he said that the the magisterium. He was talking about the magisterium. He said he came from a Catholic background, and the magisterium, or the application of Catholic social teachings, would say that the state has to get out of the business of taking care of the poor. Right? They shouldn't be there. That's what the Catholic Church would say. And then, of course, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, who I was in contact with, and they gave me their permission to put it into the book, they said, no, what you are saying has nothing to do with the church. It actually has nothing to do with Jesus. It has everything to do with Ayn Rand, you know. And then he retorted.
Also the Jesuits in Georgetown, right?
The Jesuits in Georgetown said the same thing.
Told him, right?
Yeah.
Representative.
As he was coming to Georgetown, they handed him a letter and said, you are absolutely wrong on this. And he retorted and said, well, these Catholic bishops, they don't represent all the Catholics in the United States. And then they had to come back again and say, that is precisely what we do. We represent all the bishops in the United States. What you are saying is wrong. And Ayn Rand has nothing to do with Jesus. She's just the opposite. And so, but what I found is, of course, that there are times when they agree, when Jesus and Ayn Rand agree. They would both agree on this idea of you cannot serve two masters. Either you love God and hate capital, or you love capital and hate God. And she would say, yes, that is absolutely right. Now love capital and hate God. You know what I mean? And so it was a strange type of thing, but I think that's one of the most prophetic things about this Pope is that he is becoming very, very clear as to where he stands on this issue of poverty, to where he stands on the issue of social justice. And I think that's what has made him very popular among Muslims. The last Pope, you know, God bless his soul, he antagonized, he's not dead yet, but even bless his living soul, you know. But he antagonized Muslims. And sometimes I don't think he even did it intentionally, you know what I mean, with the Regensburg speech or whatever, you know. But this Pope, in the way he talks, he sounds a lot like the Quran talks about poverty and about social justice and whatnot. And so I think, you know, there is that space for discourse among religions,
that can happen in the face of modernity. Because if we look at secular modernity and what it's doing, it's destroying in many ways those values of caring for the other, of loving for the other. The Pope says the church should be a field house, or a field hospital. That's the role of the church. It should be a field hospital to the broken, to the sick, to the poor, of all the different faiths. And the Muslims are saying, well, we've been saying that for a long time, the mosque should be a field hospital. And so, not that they do it very well, but at least that gives some kind of common platform, or some kind of common
They are
fertile
doing it
ground
very
to
well.
discuss.
See, there is a component to ISIS and to the other movements of the Brotherhood. They have a political component, they have a military component, but they also have a social one.
They do, yes.
In which, you know, when the tractors come, the Israeli army, and they roll down the olive trees and the houses and so on, then they come in and help them all, and that makes them tremendously popular.
Sure.
That's exactly why they win the votes in Lebanon and in Gaza.
And it's very similar to the early Christians who, I mean, many of them gathered a lot of interest in the movement by taking care of the sick. It was Julian the Apostate, you know, that said, you know, these Christians, they take care of their sick and their poor and whatnot, but they take care of ours too. You know what I mean? And so, I mean,
And
Christianity
you know what this
spread that
Julian
way.
Apostate did? He opened up all the temples again, and he gave the order that every temple would have a hospital, because that made the Christians so attractive.
Right.
And so he governed only 3 years, and then he fell in Persia or in India or somewhere.
Right.
And he also restored the temple in Jerusalem. They rebuilt it again, but an earthquake came and destroyed it, and so when they carried his dead body back to Rome, it had been destroyed already.
That's right. And it's very interesting that he talks about that. He would say something like this, that it's not the functionalization of poverty so that you can look good. You know what I mean? He talks about that's almost of what I called it, but what he explains, he doesn't call it this, but that's bourgeois charity. That's charity that you do, you know, in a symbolic way so that you look good, you know, among other people. So they say this person is a pious person. Look, he's a millionaire, but he spends his time giving to the poor or whatnot. The Pope said, I don't even take their money. It's tainted money. It's dirty money. They have to live with it. And then he said, when they give it to me, when they hand it to me, I say, do you sit with the poor? Do you shake their hands? Do you look them in the eye? Right? That is a much more prophetic way of being with the poor than simply just, you know, I'm a rich guy, gives it, you know.
But tainted money, you know, that comes from Jesus
That
himself,
comes from
right?
Jesus.
So tainted money is money which you have not worked for.
Right.
So money which is covered by your own work, it's okay, you know. But taking interest or profit or surplus value, that is tainted money, which is cursed.
Right, exactly.
If, a lot of the commercials on TV, especially sports, is how they collect up all this money and then they give it away, and that's all they do. And they don't experience, in most cases, the people they're giving it to.
Right.
You know, people with diseases or.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I've had this experience with people in my own family who live in a very, very, very rich, one of the top richest places in Illinois. And they give all kinds of money to the charities, and they feel good about themselves. It alleviates some of the guilt that they have about making all that money and how they made it, because somehow they did is really questionable. But if that same poor person were in their community, they would call the police immediately and have them removed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so that's the same thing that he's talking about. And the Muslims do the same thing, you know, with zakat. Zakat is almsgiving. It is an obligation for Muslims to give 2.5% of their excess wealth to the poor. An absolute obligation, right? So, and it's not this idea that you should do it because it's the law or it's going to make you feel good. It's actually their right, right? So whatever type of wealth that God has entrusted you with, it's a trust. It's not yours, right? It's a trust, and it's owed to the poor. You have to. You have no right outside of it to it. You know, it is not yours. And that's only if you got it in a right way. If you got it in a tainted way by, you know, you didn't work for it because you're a dirty bourgeois or something, then all of it is owed somewhere else. You know what I mean? So, but that, for me, when I look at that, I see this Ayn Rand type of modern secular age just impinging on us. breaking out of civil society, going into the family, so our children absorb the values of civil society. They absorb the values of simply self-interestedness. I mean, look at, they're all taking selfies of themselves. I mean, teenagers, I mean, what on the average, they're taking over 50 pictures of themselves per day. I mean, what kind of narcissistic, society are we
That's
creating?
firsthand data, isn't it?
That's firsthand data. I've got 3 teenagers, and wow, like, I love you, and you're beautiful in my eyes, but you're really beautiful in your own eyes, But it's that narcissistic type of zeitgeist that we got going on here. And so I think, and it impinges on Muslims just as it impinges on Christians, and I think Muslims and Christians and Jews and whatnot who feel it have to somehow have a discourse. They have to walk together, right, in this world, and say something and do something. But first they have to identify what exactly it is that they're doing, what exactly there is that's impinging upon them, right? And unfortunately, I would say from the Islamic perspective, it's often the time that Muslims have no idea what it is, although they feel it, but they might not be able to identify it. They might symbolize it in simply America. And they think, somehow, well, we want to keep our Islamic identity, but we like the technology, not knowing what the technology will do to them too eventually. Same thing, it undermines the instrumental rationality and everything.
And then, of course, modernity is not all bad, right? So,
Right.
therefore, they all buy into it. I mean, Iran has a theocracy, but it uses quantum physics,
Sure.
and it may not do the bomb, but it wants to have this energy, and so on. So the hospitals, medicine, and so on. So that is also dangerous with fundamentalists, that they negate things and use it at the same time. And if they don't use it, they kill themselves in the process.
Right.
So one has to be very careful. And that makes it complicated and dialectical in a certain way, because first of all, it's flesh from our flesh. It came out of Christianity, the whole thing. It
Sure.
didn't happen under Buddhism.
Right.
It didn't happen under Taoism. It happened under Christianity, and there is a good reason for it why it happened. So we must somehow own it, in a certain sense, that we are, if we are Christian, that we are responsible for it.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I'm curious about, you've said quite a bit on Christian-Islamic relations vis-a-vis modernity through the lens of social ethics, and the common ground that Pope Francis has with a lot of what's in the Quran in terms of the approach to the moral obligation to the poor. But I wonder if there might be some fruitful ground in some of the more mystical or contemplative traditions. If you were to read like Hafiz or any of the other Sufi poets vis-a-vis Meister Eckhart.
Sure.
Or, look at, it's not in the Muslim context, but I think of Thomas Merton's friendship with the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh. Christian.
There's also Jakob Böhme, for instance, right?
In the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think so, and I think that's a very old fraternity in many ways,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, of the mystics.
Mm-hmm.
Reading Rumi's poetry, Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi is probably the most famous Muslim mystic poet. And he always says, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Jew, I'm a lover of God, you know what I mean? And that's it. And therefore, any lovers of God, you know what I mean, from whatever community they come from, are my brothers and sisters, you know what I mean? And so they're able to transcend that particularity, you know what I mean, of almost the tribalism of religion.
Right.
And saying, whoever is in love with God the way I am in love with God, you know what I mean, we are together. And so I think that you find that, especially with Merton in his writing on the Buddhists, and but even more so on his writing with the Sufis. Because the Buddhists, don't take God as their object somehow, but the Sufis certainly do. They get them in trouble all the time, but, but Merton, of course, was always in trouble too.
And there seems to be a crossover there as well. I mean, like, just to take Merton as an example, he's got the interfaith crossover in terms of mystical theology and the contemplative practices, but he also got in major trouble with the social ethics part, in Seeds of Destruction.
Sure.
And was a piece in the post-Christian era, and
Right.
the stuff that his abbot said, you'll never publish this.
Right, and he was taking a stand very prophetically.
Yeah.
A very prophetic stand. Last week we talked about the lack of courage or the cowardice among religious communities to actually stand up and say something, you know what I mean? And here's this monk, sitting in the middle of Kentucky,
here, writing these very prophetic writings that disturbed his abbot, it disturbed a lot of people in the church. And other people, on the other hand, even outside of Catholicism, were reading him saying, that's a voice that transcends all that particularity, because it's simply the truth, you know what I mean? So, yeah.
Okay, do you want to have your movie?
Sure, we can put that in. And
Yeah.
so, is it here?
We promised, right? We promised.
Yes, we promised, and we have to
We have to
maintain
keep
our
our
promises.
promise.
So it's a movie about St. Francis and Sultan Malik of Kaman. It's a model for peacemaking. These were, of course, two men in the 13th century who came from two very different traditions. Islamic tradition and the Catholic Catholicism, obviously, was St. Francis. In the midst of the Crusades, they had enough courage and brotherly love that they actually, in the midst of the fighting, got to talk, to discourse.